Hello, and welcome now as we come to the seventh Sunday of Ordinary Time, which, by the way, brings to a conclusion this period between the observance of the Christmas celebrations and next week, this coming week, the beginning of the Lenten celebration. So in a certain way, not only do the readings come to a conclusion, but also our kind of celebration together. The readings begin, first of all, from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verses 9 through 12, and verses 17 through 18. We'll have an opportunity to look a little bit at this particular work later on in our discussions today. The second reading, middle reading, comes from the first letter of the Corinthians, chapter 3, verses 16 through 23. This will bring to an end our looking at this particular work of St. Paul for now, although in other times in the year we look again at different sections from this very important first remembered letter of Paul to the community at Corinth. In the Gospel of Matthew, we come now to chapter 5, to verses 38 through 48, which brings to a conclusion many of the ideas that we looked at in our previous discussion or talk. You remember that last time we were looking at, as Matthew had pointed out, that we are to be the salt and the light, and then pointed out that he had come with regard to the law, with regard to the instruction of Israel, not to do away with it, not to change it, but to bring it, as he used the words, to fulfillment. Or as we said, following a tradition of the rabbis, namely putting what they call a fence around the instruction or teachings that had been given. This time, we come to the conclusion of the examples that Jesus is pictured as using in order to say how, in a fuller way, those who believe in the message of Jesus should carry that out. So, and the kind of centering message of these two examples that we're going to look at, first of all, how do you deal with the idea of retaliation? This would be in verses 38 through 42. And then a discussion of love of enemies, namely verses 43 through 48. And that will be the kind of section of reflection that we're being offered this time. So it begins with what is perhaps one of the more famous of sayings that people hear with regard to the gospel in general, but certainly the gospel of Matthew. You have heard that I say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So this is a very famous saying. In fact, giving a little bit of a background and a history about this saying, which has to do, as I mentioned a moment ago, with retaliation. So an eye, take an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But we'll look a little bit at exactly how that was intended and why it was intended. Keeping in mind as we begin that one of the ways of solving problems in the Middle Eastern and ancient world was through blood feuds. You do something to me, to one of my family members, I will do it back to you. And maybe we'll even do it with greater force or violence than you did it to me. So how do you regulate that? How does a society? Israel alone is not the situation here, but also others. So, first of all, this particular saying appears in the Torah or in the law in three places. It appears in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verses 23 through 25, in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 24, verses 19 through 20, and in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 19, verses 21. Now you may say, well, we're not going to remember all those particular verses and chapters, and that's fine. But notice that these 3 books are part of the 5 that make up what are called the Torah or the Pentateuch. So remember, these are the 5 books, sometimes attributed to Moses, although certainly today we realize that Moses was not the author of all of this work. And in fact, we have looked at this before, the Torah or the Pentateuch is really, at best we can see today, the result of 4, at least 4 different strains of reflection, 4 different schools of religious thinking or theology, and what very carefully has been put together over the centuries were these different accounts into a harmonious continuity, thus representing the 5. So all of that is to say that the Torah does include this particular saying a number of times. And but also the Romans, in the Roman work, this was known as the Lex Talionis, Talionis, or translated the law of equals. And sometimes, of course, this is known as the Talian law, and that's often the way in which people speak about this, or we talk about this. And it said, so this is the Roman law. Now notice that there's going to be certain similarities here between the teaching of the Torah and the teaching of Roman law, which was certainly prevalent in the time of Jesus and the early Christians. If a man broke another's limb, the victim could inflict the same injury upon the wrongdoer, but only if no settlement were agreed upon. So the Roman principle here, and we're going to see that I think this was also probably very true in Jesus' time. The Roman principle was, rather than, you could go if you hurt the leg of a person, go and hurt that person's leg, but maybe it would be better solved by some kind of payment, monetary payment. And that's going to be one of the issues that certainly is important to consider here. And the only reason, says this law, that you could go and hurt somebody else's limb is if no payment agreement could be reached. So you see the priority principle here with regard to the lex talionis was only a last resort in a certain way to the violence to the person, if that could be avoided by some kind of monetary return. The ancient Babylonian code of Hammurabi, going back, of course, many years, even prior to the writing of the Torah, said this. So here, just that we see that this rule was not original in a certain way in the scriptures. If a highborn person should blind the eye of another, they shall blind his. If he should blind the eye of a commoner, or break the bone of the commoner, he shall deliver 60 shekels of silver. So even here you've got the social status. If it were highborn, well, that's one thing. If he were to do it to a commoner, therefore one who did not have that same privilege or rank, then he couldn't do harm to him. He would simply pay him off. So notice again, I will don't get repetitious here, but notice here again the use of money in order to solve the issue. The Jewish historian, whom we learn a great deal about the first century, Josephus, suggests that the talion is carried out only if the victim is unwilling to accept monetary compensation. So there again is that idea that we're looking at. The Mishnah which was an important first part of the famous Talmud. Now, the principles of the Mishnah may well have been in effect during Jesus' time, but the work itself was not written until after the first century, sometime, we believe, between the 200 and 100 and 200 of common time, that it was put into print. Now, that doesn't mean that the rules weren't being observed. See, the difference is that the earlier time it was still part of the oral or spoken tradition rather than the written tradition. And here's what the Mishnah says. He who inflicts his fellow is liable to compensation of him on 5 points. That namely, if he has caused injury, if it has caused pain, if it has involved medical costs, if it has caused loss of income, and if it has caused indignity. So the Mishnah kind of fences it in by saying these are the reasons why this kind of action might take place. So my point here is that this particular code was well known, not only among the Israelites, but also among other peoples in the Old Testament or earlier times. Now, it's important to notice here that Jesus does not dismiss an eye for an eye, but rather he teaches how to respond to this, not with physical injury, but, and here is something important, but with humiliation. You see, in a world in which honor, and we've mentioned this so often, honor and shame, were so very importantly part of the cultural experiences, not only of Israel, but also of the whole Mediterranean world, how if you might resort to something not violently, that is, bringing physical injury to a person's, but rather some other way, namely humiliate them, might you stop this action? Now, as we pointed out, the whole reason for this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth rule was to limit the amount of violence that one could render against another. So, does it make some sense? If someone takes your eye, well, you could take the eye of the person who took it. If someone knocks out your tooth, well, you could knock out the tooth of the person who did that to you. So you notice that really what you have done here is preserve life. Because some would say, well, you knock out my eye, I'm going to kill you for it. Well, you see, that's an extreme. And so what the rule by all who embraced this kind of rule was to look for a balance, some kind of way in which the extremes would not be done. And even then, if one carefully looks, we're not going to go too much into this, but in the book of Deuteronomy, it does point out some interesting situations, or in Exodus book. So if the person who strikes out your eye is blind out of one eye, you cannot, and the rule even here varies, you cannot take out the eye of that person who did that, because then you would totally blind the man, and that's proportionately wrong. So you see, of course, now that you would smile and say, that's an interesting example. But so if a one-eyed man took one of your eye out, you couldn't go back and get him by his good eye, because then that, obviously would be disproportionately incorrect. So, what does Jesus say here? He suggests that you don't resist the evildoer, the one who does this kind of deed, with physical violence, but namely, find a way to dishonor him. And so what one follows next, or finds next in the little section of the gospel we're looking at here, is that a slap or a swat or a subjugation does not escalate violence, but you also don't give up on doing something. So, what do we hear? If someone strikes you on the cheek, now, Matthew, by the way, is the only one who tells you which cheek this is, calls it the right cheek. This same verse is found in Luke and Mark, but it is Matthew who kind of here, and we'll look at it because this is how he looks at it. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek so that he can strike you. Now, well, what's this? Jesus is advocating, hit back. Isn't that really defeating the very point that we're making? But keep in mind that it's a question of honor. Now, if and left-handed people here, I apologize a little bit because these rules were developed assuming that the right hand is the hand of honor. Sorry, left-handed people, but the left hand in Middle Eastern culture was not the honorable hand. It was the hand that was reserved for toilet functions. It was a serious insult if you were invited to dinner, to put your left hand on the table. And you never were to be eating publicly with the left hand. And when you greeted others, as we do, to give a handshake, it was an insult to give the left hand. So all of that's a little bit of cultural background. I know left-handed people here are probably going to, wait a minute, but that was the way it was understood. So the right hand is the hand of dignity. So if I strike the person, assuming it's a right-handed person, on the cheek, I was tempted to give an example, but I won't do that here. If you turn your face to the other cheek, then if I'm going to strike you again, I'm going to have to hit you with the back of my hand. And there again would be a gesture of dishonor, of shaming. The person who did it would be dishonored and shamed. You see, plus also just realistically, even if I did it, if I'm right-handed, the force of my swing is stronger this way than it is when I come this way. And so what the advocacy of this principle is, look, do you want to be dishonored or shamed? And so a person could do it, but notice where that person would put himself in respect to certainly those who were around him and watching. And so what is maybe the possibility here is that as the striker gets ready to do it again, thinks twice about that. And so therefore, see, that action might be stopped. All right? So that's a little bit of the background of turning the other cheek, often quoted by many outside of our tradition, or sometimes just say, well, go ahead, turn the other cheek, see how that shows weakness. Really, it's not a sign of weakness, but is a sign of strength, saying, we can play this game according to the culture, and you know the rules, and I know the rules. Go ahead, see what's going to, see what you want to do. Because otherwise, hitting back simply escalates the violence, which gives social inequality, and it can have deadly effects. But if you look at this whole example, that might not happen. All right. If someone says, give me your cloak, what you should do is, and the cloak, of course, keeping in mind in the first century world, that basically people wore two layers of cloak. of clothes, the outside layer and the inner layer. How different is that from, well, our culture, although we certainly do it much differently. We have the outside garments that you wear, and then we have the clothes underneath. What do you call it? Underneath, underwear, okay? So we are a little more sophisticated, perhaps, than the first ancient times were. So they had these two sets of clothing, the cloak, which would be the outer garment, or the word for that is the tunic. I'm sorry, would be the Now, why is this outer garment? I pause a little bit here, because the outer garment, the cloak, for some, particularly for the poor, was not only what they wore during the daytime for comfort and protection, but also it was their sleeping bag. In the evening, they would use that to sleep on. That's why one of the rules said, as an aside, that if you took the cloak from someone as part of a payment, you had to return it, whether they did this or not, but you were supposed to return it to the person from whom you took it by sundown so that they would have something to sleep on. All right, that's the cloak. Now the tunic is the underwear. So if someone takes from you your cloak and then you give them your tunic, how do you stand? You stand unclothed or naked. And that, of course, would put the person, now you could say, well, the person who is not clothed would be shamed. Yes, but how did that person get in that condition? Because of the one who demanded the cloak and now got the tunic. That person would be shamed or dishonored. So you see, it's a second example of what? Fighting back, if you want, or taking the initiative to see how you could stop the action of violence from continuing. The third example is that if you are forced to carry goods for 1 mile, carry it for 2 miles. Now, we know that this was also the case, that obviously the occupiers of the Holy Land at this time were the soldiers. And it was legal and customary for soldiers to force citizens to carry their military gear for 1 mile. Now, in itself, that was an act of humiliation because most of the time the person forced to do this would be some member of the Jewish community, and there certainly was a certain humiliation in that action. One remembers, for example, when Jesus is on the way to the cross, that they forced Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross behind Jesus. So this idea of forcing someone into actions that they did not want to do would often humiliate, certainly, the person. But if you then, when you went 1 mile, went 2 miles, now what did you do? You put the soldier in a kind of interesting position because he was being humiliated by the fact that he was making someone who was being part of the oppressed community go well beyond the limit which was asked. Now, in a certain way, the person doing this would be, you could say, well, more humiliated. And, well, who was it that decided who would carry the military apparatus of the soldier? But often it was a fellow Jew who appointed a Jew to do this. So there's a lot of interaction here that is behind the scene when one looks at this particular gesture. So that's all this whole little section here of, in a certain way, taking a stance against the violator of oppression, no matter whether it was the slap, maybe it was the clothing, whether it was forcing to make them do some action. In the book of Proverbs, it says, is what we might call Proverbs. This would be a very important collection of works, as you know, in the Hebrew Bible. But in chapter 25, it says this. It's a backhanded mandate. If your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat. And if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. The rationale here, as the book of Proverbs sees it, is not to turn enemies into friends, but to frustrate them. If the enemy gives you food to do, what do you do? So, all of that. Now, the final one here in verses 40 through 48, as you have heard it said that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and spirit, and love your enemy, and love one another, and hate your enemies. Now, please understand, nowhere in the Hebrew Bible is it ever said that you should hate your enemies. So for whatever reason, Matthew includes that as part of the teaching of Jesus here. All right, so that is an addition. So love your enemies, okay? Now, the Jewish community understood, and here again is the book of Leviticus, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. So neighbor here was understood in the Hebrew Bible as a fellow Israelite. Certainly what the teaching that Matthew sees, and always certainly writing for fellow Hebrews, is that this needs to be extended. Again, that's very important. We've heard that, and you get a lot of great sermons, certainly, on this aspect of Jesus' teaching. Finally, in verse 42, let me just comment on this. It says, give to him who asks you for a loan, and do not refuse one who is unable to pay interest. Now, keep in mind that, first of all, that this basically had to do with a fellow Israelite giving some money or help to a fellow Israelite. You could not charge interest on them. This, of course, becomes known as usury, and it was true that in some quarters the amount of interest exerted or asked was from 100 to 200%. And so that was certainly terrible. But it did not say that Israelites could not give money to Gentiles and expect interest back. So I want to be clear here just how this was working. So if you're going to be kind to Gentiles, you need to be very careful on how much interest you act. And finally, in verse 48, it says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. A better translation of that, although you will not hear that in the ones that we have, is be like him. Now, what does this mean? Be as generous and merciful as you can to others as God is to us. If the idea of God as perfect does not appear in the Old Testament, and it lends itself, perfection here, to an abstraction. If you think about it, something which is perfect. What's perfect? Well, it might refer to a work of art. But if we think about it, if something is perfect, it can never change. Because if it's missing something, it wasn't perfect. If you change it afterwards, it's not perfect. I've mentioned this before, and certainly this is part of what's called the Holiness Code, is really Israel is being called to be holy as God is holy. So the wholeness of God, the holiness of God is for all the people. And perhaps in looking at the Hebrew here, the word is not perfect, a noun, but perfecting a verb, something which is going on. And maybe that is interesting, that God is continually perfecting. God is a God of motion. God is a God of action. And one way to think of the image of God as we conclude here is something of God not in place, but God as moving forward, perhaps always leading us, perhaps always encouraging and calling us to holiness. So those are some of the thoughts that we are invited to look at as we conclude this special season called Ordinary Time, and as we prepare in this coming week, this coming Wednesday, for the beginning of the great season of Lent. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.